I can always stand up. I need height.
Could I please ask everybody to sit down? We are running a little bit late, so we should start right away.
Thank you, sir.
Everybody, please. Okay. Everybody, please sit down so we can start. Thank you.
Everybody, please, may I have your attention? Kindly be seated. I kindly ask you to be seated. And in the back of the room, please, either come in or step outside. We need to proceed with the program.
Thank you. May I have your attention, please, everybody? Today, Lebanon's electric power needs are estimated to be between 2.5 and 3 gigawatts. Yet, the public power generation system can generate not more than 1.8 gigawatts. Consequently, practically every family and business in Lebanon is faced with the choice of a complete power blackout for 12 or 18 hours a day, or paying for additional expensive power from private generators. According to a recent study by the Lebanese University, Professor Osama Ibrahim and his co-workers, this gap, this power shortage in Lebanon, is increasing at an alarming rate. The last power plant built in Lebanon was in 1996, and the sole official provider of power, EDL, suffers, according to that study, huge technical, generation, transmission, distribution, administrative, and financial problems. Not less than 3 official reform plans have been developed by the Lebanese Ministry of Energy and Water since 2006, yet none of them was ever implemented. The declared goal of reaching 12% share of renewable energy in the power sector by 2020 may have the same fate given the current political deadlock. 93% of Lebanon's total primary energy supply is oil, and Lebanon is a major oil importer, despite the possible evidence of the existence of oil and natural gas in the Lebanese onshore and offshore, Lebanese lands onshore and offshore. Therefore, some of the questions, important questions, facing us today are the following. And these questions will set the framework for our discussions with the goal of deriving specific recommendations. I'm going to remind the panel members here, whom I will ask to introduce themselves in a couple of minutes, that our goal is to really stay focused on articulating first and discussing particular recommendations that we would like to pass on to both the nation at large and policymakers in Lebanon. So the questions that we are facing are 5 questions. First one, what is the appropriate balance between renewable and fossil fuel resources for energy production in Lebanon? And what are these efficient renewable resources that are particularly suited for Lebanon? A lot of us know about solar energy. We'll hear today from a specialist, world leader specialist on offshore wind turbine, energy resources, if Lebanon is suited for that particular renewable energy. Third, what is the best model for investment? So we have with us panel members who are particularly versed in the arts and science of investing in power solutions around the world. So the question of what's the best model for investing financial resources specifically proceeds from future energy production if, for example, the speculation of the existence of vast oil and gas resources offshore turn out to be true. Fourth question, how to develop the technical capacity and know-how that would provide the labor force necessary for prospective job opportunities. And finally, what is the economic feasibility of privatizing the electric production network in Lebanon? So to help us answer these questions and come up with recommendations, we have very distinguished panelists with us, whom I would like to ask to take no more than 30 seconds and introduce themselves. We'll start with Mr. Sassin.
Thank you. My name is George Sassin. I'm the co-founder and the president of the Lebanese Oil and Gas Initiative, LOGI, which is a non-profit focusing on raising awareness and advocating and lobbying to develop our oil and gas resources in Lebanon. In my private sector career, I lead a part of a business for General Electric, for GE Power. So I'll be focusing my comments today on the oil and gas sector and a little bit on the electricity sector.
Good morning, I'm Habib Dagher. I work at the University of Maine, director of the Composite Center. We have about 180 people who work there, and we're leading up efforts in the US today to deploy floating wind turbines off the US coast. In 2019, we'll be deploying 2 floating turbines 14 miles off the coast using concrete hulls. I'm here today to talk about the opportunities that Lebanon could have in offshore wind energy.
Omar Sawaf. I'm a Houston, Texas resident, founder and partner of Yellowstone Capital, a private equity and venture capital firm. We focus on a few industries, and one of the major industries we focus on investing in is the energy sector. We have been very active both in conventional energy, oil and gas, as well as have spent a lot of time and investments in new technologies, mainly renewable energy like solar, wind, and fuel cells. Happy to be here.
Yeah, my name is Ziad Azar. I'm a lawyer at White & Case, based in New York. I represent government and financial institutions in developing big infrastructure projects, both in the Middle East and in the United States. I've worked on these in Africa, Latin America, Europe, and North America. I've also worked in the World Bank, where I was helped launch the doing business report that was mentioned earlier this morning on the cost regulation and regulatory policy.
My name is Joseph Debley. I have been in Canada for 45 years. The first 10 years of my career, I spent them on fixing the Canadian deuterium, uranium, can do for short, nuclear reactor. I'm happy to say that in 1983, we had the biggest nuclear accident in Canada, where we were 90 seconds away from the point of no return. And every can-do reactor built to that date needed to have its core completely replaced. That was an economic disaster in addition to the physical reality disaster that problem presented. I was fortunate enough to invent a method that averted the need to replace all the core of this nuclear reactor and salvage 18 can-do nuclear reactors around the world. After that, I spent 15 years teaching at McMaster University, and the last 14, 15 years, with the help of my 2 sons and daughter, have established 3 technology companies, one of them in intelligent lighting, one of them in water purification, and now realizing I used to think that I'm smart until I start working with my children. So I resolved to go back and provide for them what they will need and what their contemporary and future generation need. So I'm developing a health science and innovation park in Oakville, Ontario. That place will house about 20,000 workers and people living there. And my children, and with me is one of my son, Romanos. He's spearheading the establishment of a research center and a research incubator that will be a model, hopefully, not only for Canada, but for Lebanon and the rest of the world.
Thank you. So to summarize, we have with us an inventor, a technical problem solver, dedicated to pushing new technologies in the energy sector, alternative technologies. We have a world specialist on the legal aspects of big deals between corporations and governments in the energy and oil and gas sectors. And we also have a investor who is specialized specifically in pinpointing promising technologies and promising companies that are in the energy sector and help them grow. And we have with us a world leader of one of the most promising, non-polluting, effective, and cost-effective also energy production concepts, which is now very far from a concept. We're talking about offshore wind energy production. And finally, we have with us, luckily, someone who's following a family tradition of transparency, good governance in Lebanon, the nephew of Minister of Parliamentarian Sassin, I'm sorry, Bustros, is that right, your uncle? Your uncle. That's right. That's right. So the tradition is that of public awareness, of educating the Lebanese public on what the issues are and what the reality is. So the first question I would like to address to Mr. Sassin regarding exactly what's going on, whether things are real. We all have heard about these offshore tremendously promising resources of oil and gas, yet there has not been any drilling. In the US, that would be considered speculation. Is it more than speculation? If it is, how should we manage the expectation of the Lebanese public, which is now at an all-time high? And if it's real, what are your recommendations for proceeding with plans that have really started and stalled? Please go ahead.
Thank you. Well, we're all aware that Lebanon could have oil and gas resources. What's really interesting is if you look at the history of us developing and exploring for oil and gas, it starts in the 1930s, believe it or not. In the 1930s, the French mandate passed legislation to encourage Lebanese to start exploring for oil in our land, onshore, right? And you know, it's been on and off for several decades. And in 2010, Minister Bassil was the champion that kickstarted this industry, so we thank you for that. What happened is, three things happened that gives us hope that there could be significant oil and gas resources in Lebanon. But the reality is that we don't know how much we have. And this is really important for people to understand, because there's a misconception that we are oil rich. The reality is we do not know yet. What do we know? We know three things. In 2010, the US government, or the US Geological Survey, did a study on the Eastern Mediterranean Sea. Basically, it's the sea that goes from Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Egypt, Cyprus. And they came up with a study saying that there's a high probability there could be significant oil and gas resources offshore in that sea. Now, the second thing that happened is that our neighbors, Israel, Cyprus, Egypt, started drilling, and they did find significant oil and gas resources. But there's a hiccup. In some cases, they were not as successful as they thought they would be. You know, Cyprus, for example, went and they drilled 2 dry holes, and nothing was there. But they did find gas resources in other blocks of their sea. So it's really interesting to learn from their experience and what they've done, which is there could be oil and gas resources, but we have to be careful on how excited and how much we think we have. What we have done in Lebanon is we've done seismic surveys. So what this is, if you want to simplify it, is it's as if you're getting an X-ray, right? And what these studies came back and said was that there's a high probability of having significant oil and gas resources. They did confirm it. But the reality is we will not really know how much oil and gas we have until we actually start drilling. And I think this is where everything stops. So what's happened is under Minister Bassil, they've started the first licensing process where they started inviting international oil companies to invest and start drilling, but that process has been on hold. Given the political paralysis in the country, everything is on hold. So until we actually start drilling, we will not know how much oil and gas resources we have. So we should not get ahead of ourselves. We should not get too excited because we could have a lot or not. The signs are promising.
Well, thanks for reviewing the situation there, but could you suggest specific recommendations on, now that the expectations are so high, what should policymakers do to move forward with? First, there is practical aspects of drilling, but more importantly, also from your point of view, is the public awareness
Yeah, so
issue.
I think the very first thing we need to be doing is managing expectations, right? So promising the Lebanese that oil and gas is going to solve all our problems, that we are oil rich, is not the way to go. So communicating the right messages is key, and I'm going to give you a very particular example to tell you why. In Ghana in 2007, the government came out and said, we have a lot of oil and gas resources. We're all rich. We won't have any problems going forward. People were really excited, went to the streets, and then what happened is like the politicians were under pressure to deliver. So they started spending money to show results. They spent money they didn't have. 4 years later, they started bringing in the revenues from the oil and gas sector, and it was not as much as they thought it was going to be. So Ghana ended up from being like the rising star of Africa to really suffering from a debt crisis because they overspent, and now the IMF is bailing them out. This sounds very silly. It's a very real example that happened, and the lesson for us and the recommendation to our decision makers is manage expectations. We do not know how much oil and gas we have until we start drilling, and we won't make any dime out of our oil and gas resources at least before 7 years if you start drilling today.
Great. So to summarize, you're recommending that we manage expectations through public awareness campaigns, both from private sector and the public sector, the government, more transparency, I presume you're referring to, and also avoid the example of Ghana that you mentioned. So speaking of transparency and public information, we all heard that 2 months ago, there was an announcement by Minister Bassil, and after meeting with the head of the parliament in Lebanon, that there will be kickstarting again the project of exploitation of oil and gas in Lebanon. Yet we have not heard detail of the plan. So luckily for us, we have the minister with us, who hopefully today will tell us what this plan is about, why we haven't heard details for 2 months. But so we have the opportunity to have the within this workshop, the minister enlighten us on what the vision is for starting again these exploration into the exploitation and possibly having concessions offshore.
Would you mind, can I say something about that?
Sorry, yes, please go ahead.
I think this is critical. People need to understand, right? Risk of corruption in Lebanon is very high. We all know this, right? It's not a secret. Imagine there's corruption in the oil and gas sector in the future if it ever starts. This is not like corruption in other sectors. This could be grand corruption. We are talking about billions of dollars that are at risk, that is amounts of money that we've never seen in our lives in Lebanon, right? So the risks are really high. And so the importance of transparency is critical and vital for the future of our country. Not the future of our oil sector or our energy sector, but the future of our country. And transparency starts here. And Minister Bassil, this goes to you. I think it's very important for everybody. You went on TV a couple months ago with the Amal party and announced that a deal has been reached to resume the oil and gas sector in Lebanon, correct? Yeah. Everybody is asking this question. What was the disagreement about in the first place? What was this agreement? And why hasn't anything happened since? And I think it's really, honestly, I'm not saying this as a criticism, it's really a question that we ask you, we ask other decision makers. These oil and gas resources are the ownership of all the Lebanese citizens, correct? So it is our right to know. And officially, in the name of my organization, Logi, we ask you officially to please make an official press release and statement to explain to people what is this deal. Because there's a lot of rumors going in the media on what this deal could entail. Probably these rumors are incorrect. And these rumors say, some people say that part of the deal is to give the southern blocks to Russian companies to explore. I have no idea if these are true or not. It doesn't matter. What matters is there's a big question mark on what's going on, what's going to happen.
Thank you, Sassin. Thanks. I think point is well made. Maybe we can come back to that during our discussion session. So I will definitely. I will make the official statement now. Wonderful. So we have a promise from the minister to make an official statement. So it will be not only a fruitful panel discussion, but a historic one. So I would like to follow up on what Mr. Sassin said regarding, first you mentioned the issue of finances. So let's say, hopefully these resources turn out to be real. We have major players from around the world who would like to have concessions in Lebanon. There'll be bidding, there'll be major legal and financial challenges. One question that comes up, and there are echoes of these questions around the third world, is when a third world country discovers major resources, and if, as often the case, these same countries are suffering from severe corruption in the political system, how should the money be managed? Should the sign-up fee for these major corporations wishing to have concessions go directly into the national treasury with the promise to erase debt? Or should it be handled differently? Should it go directly into funding particular projects, public projects in Lebanon? So for that, I would like to address Mr. Sawaf and ask him from his experience, how should we handle the proceeds starting from the sign-up fees of these companies, should we go forward if resources exist? And if you have specific recommendations on how to avoid this money's path becoming questionable and becoming tied up in corruption.
Thank you, Edgar. First of all, I've got to start with the premise that any resources we find in Lebanon, any energy found, is for the people of Lebanon. And I do have a specific recommendation, but that doesn't mean that the government is not doing that. I'm just not aware of what's going on in Lebanon. But it seems to me like it's very simple. The specific recommendation would be number one, first hire a team of Lebanese investment bankers and lawyers to help the government conduct an auction, a beauty contest to invite major oil and gas companies with expertise in this area. And specifically, tell the team of advisors that, of course, we're going to go with the best economic deal presented by these companies who has the technology and the capital to extract these resources. But put a condition that upfront sign-in bonus, dollars coming in, should go towards developing the infrastructure. Because if we find natural gas, and most likely it's going to be natural gas, that natural gas is needed. A vast majority of Lebanon, if I understand it, power plants are fed by diesel, which is the most inefficient and polluting way to generate power. Creating electricity using turbines, using natural gas as a feedstock, is much more efficient, cheaper, and less polluting. So I would put a condition for a major oil and gas companies to make their bid that they would not only enter into a production sharing agreement, but that they would commit to build the infrastructure, build a pipeline to bring natural gas onshore to feed the existing power plants who might need retrofitting, and commit to do that themselves and create jobs in Lebanon. So effectively, you're killing two birds with one stone. You are developing the resources that Lebanon needs. The natural gas will come in and displace the imported diesel for our power generation. And that creates jobs. It keeps the resources to get the energy and the power needed for the Lebanese, which is, improves the way of life. That's my specific.
Great. So to summarize, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you're recommending specifically that this whole enterprise, if it goes forward, should be under the oversight of a team of Lebanese investors, leading investors and lawyers, and that there will be an auction conducted under their oversight, and then a lot of the upfront fees, a lot of the sign-up fees for this company should go directly first into the infrastructure of delivering, instead of having the government manage the building of these transmission stations or transmission guides to the shore. That should be part of the concessions responsibilities themselves, and getting the companies involved directly in public works in Lebanon as part of their payment as opposed to cash to the Lebanese government. These are wonderful ideas, and I've noted them down. But I would like to, and I wonder what kind of legal repercussions. Can the Lebanese government do that? Can the Lebanese government negotiate a contract where Total or BP build roads in the Bekaa Valley, or in some? Is that possible? Are there precedents to this kind of deals?
Yeah, definitely, and we do that all the time in our practice. We negotiate concession agreements, and in my practice, we represent the government, so I wear the hat of the government lawyer, and we always put as a foremost the government interest. So the first advice I give is that as a government, you should not rush the RFP process and the bidding process. The bidding process should be very thoughtful and carefully made, so that, because at that particular point, your leverage is the highest. Once at that point, companies are bidding and competing against each other in order to win and get the contract, and that's where you have to put your best foot forward and get the best contractual terms within, of course, the industry practice. You don't want to be unreasonable. In these terms, you can, of course, incorporate some development obligations to develop the sector, including pipelines or even more than pipelines, in order to develop the capacities. One thing I have in mind always when I negotiate concession agreements for the government is what should be the royalties, which is the juice of everything, because you're giving these zones in order to get money. And the royalties, whether it's in the form of a production sharing agreement or money based on the production or the sale of hydrocarbons, is an important concept. And the first question I ask the government when we go to negotiation is price reopeners. And that's important because these contracts last for 20, 30 years sometimes. And that's a politically fraught concept, but it's important from a government perspective to keep in mind, will the economic deal remain the same 20 years later than it is today? And based on some objective criteria that we can define together, we can find a way to permit the government to rebalance the economics of the contract and put it back at the level when it was originally started.
So Dr. Azar pretty much is giving his stamp of approval for Mr. Sawaf's recommendation that these things are not only a good idea, but they practically can be done. Specifically, Dr. Azar, can you tell us, I don't put you on the spot, but maybe you can point to the Lebanese government cases to avoid, specific cases and cases to emulate. I presume you've been involved with those cases that are worth emulating.
Yeah, that's a good point, but my job as a lawyer is to avoid you having to emulate your contract. So I help you negotiate a contract that puts you in a position that will make you not in a situation to annul and get into litigations. But I am aware of situations where we had to renegotiate, and I'm working now on similar matters, but because of my confidentiality, I can't name countries or governments. But yes, it happens.
Great. Well, we have been talking about oil and gas, and we start by asking, do they really exist? Do they exist in quantities that would be profitable, that would be workable? It's a question that still had to be answered, and hopefully will be answered soon. And we'll hear from the minister on when we will have an answer to this question. The other question, one of the main 5 questions I posed, which were transmitted to me by our consul, is the kind of balance we should maintain between these traditional fossil fuel resources and new renewable alternative types of energy. And luckily we have with us 2 inventors, 2 leading engineers with vast knowledge and experience in developing and in pushing these ideas to application level. So starting with Professor Daguerre, from your experience here in having the first wind turbine energy station in America that's connected to the grid, which is a major achievement, is Lebanon a potential candidate? Does Lebanon see wind situation? Is it amenable to this kind of technology? Do we know the answer to that question? And if we don't, are there any things practically we can do in terms of exploration of the Lebanese shoreline to determine if these turbines will be ideal? Because as I'm sure you'll tell us, these are almost too good to be true from the point of pollution, energy production, return on investment, and solutions in general to a small country like Lebanon. So please go ahead.
Thank you again. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you, Minister Vasile, and others for organizing this conference. Last week I was in Boston in a meeting with the Secretary of Energy, Secretary Moniz, and the Secretary of the Interior, Secretary Jewell. And they launched an offshore wind strategy for the United States, a very ambitious strategy to deploy over 50 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2050 in the US. Let's talk a bit about offshore wind before I answer the question. Offshore wind energy is a growing industry, not only in the US, but throughout the world. Europe is leading offshore wind development in the world. They have about 13,000 megawatts of offshore wind installed. In the US, within 50 miles of the US coast, there's enough offshore wind capacity to power the country 4 times over. There's 4,000 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity within 50 miles of the US coast. It takes 1,000 gigawatts to power the US. So that's why there's an offshore wind strategy here in the US, and that's why we're working very hard to implement this strategy. Let's look at Lebanon today. Does Lebanon have these resources or not? The answer is we don't know. Just like George said about the oil and gas industry, how oil and gas rich are we? We don't know. How offshore wind rich are we? We really don't know. So I think the first step is really try to identify how much offshore wind energy there is off the Lebanese coast. There are some studies, general paper studies that have been done, and those are very well known, that show that there's potentially some opportunity in the Eastern Mediterranean, but we need to dig a little bit deeper and do more studies. And these studies can be done relatively easily in 2 to 3 years. If you look at a typical offshore wind farm in Europe, these farms today are about 500 megawatts each, to about 1,000 megawatts. What can they do in Lebanon? We just talked about a gap between our generation capacity of about 1,500 megawatt and our needs of about 2,500 megawatt. We have about 1,000 megawatt gap. That's a great opportunity to introduce offshore wind energy, potentially in Lebanon.
But you're recommending we find out. I presume you're not recommending we do more paper studies. Is there anything physically we can put in the sea to go around the map and find out? And if this, how much does it cost?
Yeah, the answer is yes. There are new technologies to measure winds offshore using floating LiDAR technologies. These are lasers that float on buoys that measure wind speeds in the 100 to 200 meter range where the rotor of the turbine exists. We've designed and built one of them in our lab, and it's currently operating in the northeast United States, about 14 miles offshore.
How expensive is a buoy?
It's about $1 million per buoy.
And how long does it take for it to map the Lebanese coastline?
These buoys map the wind speed right above the buoy itself, so vertically above the buoys. That's what they do. We probably could use about 3 buoys off the coast of Lebanon and then get them out there for 2 to 3 years. That'll give us a good idea including other analytical studies, as to how much offshore wind capacity.
Okay, so here's a recommendation from Mrs. Baidoun right there, who's taking the notes. Yeah. 3 buoys, $3 million. Anybody wants to write a check? In 3 years, we'll have the answer. So, is that right?
That's certainly a
333. Okay.
That's certainly a very first step.
So if the answer is yes, again, speculating like we are speculating about the oil and gas, what does it mean? Is this a small slice of the pie, 0.1% of our total energy production capacity, need rather, or is it, or can it grow to be significant? And what's the right balance? Is it something? Let's take the best case scenario where Lebanon is ideally suited for this technology. How can you? What do you see in the future? What are your recommendations?
Certainly, building a farm, if there is a good resource in Lebanon, building a farm in that 400 to 500 megawatt range is certainly feasible. If there's a resource, that would provide us about 40 to 50% of the gap capacity. But of course, wind energy is not on all the time.
Yes.
So if you have about a 30% capacity factor, 500 megawatts times 30% is about 150 megawatts. So it's going to be about 15% of the gap that Lebanon has.
So to get an idea, you said 400 to 500 megawatts. The one you put offshore recently, what's the power level of that station?
Yeah, the capacity, the current contract we have with the Department of Energy is to put 2 test turbines off the coast of Maine, and each is 6 megawatts.
Okay.
So that's
so we're talking about orders of magnitude bigger. Are there precedents for this kind of capacity offshore now in the world? I know Norway is very active in that department.
Yes, Europe last year installed 3,000 megawatt of offshore wind capacity. As of today, they have 13,000 megawatt already installed.
How much?
13,000 megawatts already installed in Europe. Our other partners in the Mediterranean Sea are doing the same. France, for example, just put a tender for offshore wind projects.
In the Mediterranean or the Atlantic?
One in the Mediterranean and two in the Mediterranean, one in the Atlantic. Okay. And that's done well. They've announced the winners of that tender. So France is doing it, and other Mediterranean countries are doing it. Last year in Europe, we had a total capacity of wind installed of 142 gigawatts. Okay, a gigawatt is a nuclear power plant, right? 142 gigawatts of wind already installed in Europe, but mostly on land. Only 13 gigawatts is offshore.
Right.
So there's a lot of opportunities here for potentially for Lebanon to look at not just oil resource, but also say offshore wind resource.
Those of us, we'll come back to questions. Those of us who visit Lebanon often don't usually think of it as a windy place. So we hope it is, somehow maybe offshore. Of course, the mountains gets windy, but the mountains are not a good place to build these farms.
I think you're right. Lebanon really doesn't have a lot of places to put large farms on land. We're a very heavily, densely populated country. We have large mountains, but offshore we have a lot of space. And typically, offshore wind is a lot steadier and stronger in most places in the world than it is on land. So we have a real opportunity offshore because we are a landlocked country, and we have a very small real estate. So we should look at that. Whether it makes sense or not, the data will tell us if we go ahead and launch a study.
Yeah. However, even Lebanon is thought of not to be a windy country. It is thought of to be a sunny country. We have more than 300 days of full sunshine a year, which is one of pretty high record in countries who are that are either industrialized or industrializing. So another alternative energy power has been we've been talking about for years is solar power, and I would like to first ask Mr. Sassine again before I ask Dr. Debly about the technical side of solar power. What is the status of solar power in Lebanon right now, and has your organization been looking into that and recommending specific paths towards making it a larger fraction of power production in Lebanon?
Yeah, sure. First of all, my organization is mainly focused on the oil and gas sector, but let me just comment on the renewable sector in Lebanon. the Ministry of Energy came up with a very ambitious plan to reach 20% renewables by 2020, if I'm 2025, 2012. Yeah. So the issue with renewables is this, right? We want more of it. It is not always cost effective when it competes with other technologies. So if you were the government and you have to take your decision on how to manage your electricity sector, you have three decisions you have to take. The first one is you have to make the most economic choice. What is the most cost-effective, cheapest technology that you can go with, right? The second is the environmental issue, climate change. Which technology is going to enable you to reduce the negative impacts on the environment? And the third thing is energy security. And so what happens is it's very hard to balance out these three issues. So when you talk about renewables, it is not the most cost-efficient technology, right? It is the most environmental one, and from an energy security perspective, it's positive. But think about it this way. The sun, the wind, the sun is during the day. You don't have it at night when you actually need the electricity. The wind blows at night, same issue. So the biggest problem is energy storage. You're unable to store this electricity. And then the other problem is that the electricity that comes out of renewables is intermittent. The sun comes and goes throughout the day. The wind blows, throughout the day, and it doesn't blow. So your electricity is going to fluctuate with it. So what this means when you want to manage your electricity grid, you need several gas power plants to be able to ramp up and make the gap as you're managing this. So to answer this, in order to increase the integration of renewables in our electric grid, we need to balance it out with other fossil fuel energies like natural gas in order to enable it and take it off.
Before I ask the legal expert to help us address some of the policy issues regarding balancing renewable and fossil fuel resources, I would like to stay a little bit on the technical level since we're talking about these options technically. Dr. Dagher, you have a long history of exploring these alternative energies. You're an inventor. You left Lebanon and came to Canada, and since then you have managed to find still great solutions for many problems, including, I was told, even a way to dim fluorescent lights and make light bulbs smart. And now you're building a small system in Ontario, intellectual ecosystem that centered around alternative energy, centered around research and development. Do you have recommendations on how to copy that or adapt it to Lebanon, especially in the area of solar energy and possibly other alternative energies?
I certainly do have a bag of good news for this conference. And please allow me to take 1 second to answer the call of His Excellency Minister Bassil. I will be your first foot soldier to go back to fight the war in Lebanon. But my war is to establish a human right. And I define a human right as our...
A
human rights.
Right.
I define human rights as our minister said, that nobody should go to bed hungry, that every Lebanese or visitor to Lebanon is entitled to trust the water he drinks, that they can breathe a fresh breath of Lebanese air, and to have electricity 24/7. That's, in my view, that is, in my view, our simple objective. And it really pains me to no end that the Civil War nearly stopped in 1992. And now, over 20 years later, we in North Lebanon have less than 12 hours a day of electricity. I just came back from there. I have to rent my own generator to weather the August heat in El Khura.
Dr. Dagher, as a foot soldier, now that you volunteered to be one, what would you do? What would you recommend from your experience? We have tremendous amount of potential for solar power. It's not the most efficient thing in the world, but it is to some extent cheap to implement. What would you do that hasn't been done in Lebanon? What would you recommend that we do?
I recommend that
we should probably cut these, a good part of the blackouts that we experience in Lebanon. 12
Absolutely,
hours.
absolutely. I do have a beautiful roadmap to solve the energy crisis in Lebanon, specifically the electricity generation.
Can we have some specific recommendations?
Specific. We need to combine different technology together to overcome the limitation that we so much hear about. I, as an engineer, as an inventor, I refuse to stop by defining the problem. That is my starting point. That's where I get going. Wind energy is intermittent. Solar energy is intermittent. But look around us. Elon Musk, the Tesla car, have produced the most fascinating electrical battery energy storage in the world. Combining these energy storage elements, as my young son has suggested and has been studying over the past 6 months, we can build a house that is completely independent from being even connected to the electrical grid. So put solar, put wind, put geothermal, and put energy storage and thermal storage, and we can solve the problem in no time. All these limitations that we're talking about will evaporate.
All right, well, these are wonderful, practical, specific recommendations. But like myself, I'm a scientist and engineer like you, we tend to think that if the world is left for us, we'll fix everything. But we tend to forget there's government, there are policies, there are legal aspects, and finances.
Of
so
course.
Let me just leave the technicality. We've already impressed the audience that we know we have great solutions. Offshore, solar panel, batteries,
geothermal,
and so on, geothermal, and so on. So now let's talk a little bit about, aside from dreaming about them, what can we do policy-wise and finance-wise to push this agenda? So let me start with Dr. Azar, and we'll come back to you, Dr. Dagher. From your experience dealing with these development programs specifically around the Arab world, what can we do to push these agendas forward?
Yeah, definitely. And I think our neighbors in the Arab world and in the Gulf areas have understood the importance of the private sector, not only as a contributor of funds, but also as people who will bring the rigor of the private sector in the management of these power projects. And so if you look around you in the Gulf region, and we and myself in my firm, we represented multiple governments down there, all of them have adopted pretty much 5 major policy issues that turn out to be successful and that can be implemented in Lebanon just by taking them. And it's not reinventing the wheel, really. The first one, all of these countries have adopted the private-public partnership model, through which the government has adopted legislation enabling them to unbundle production facilities from the transmission facilities and allowing private equity, together with the government in joint venture agreements, to build and develop these power plants and big infrastructure projects. That's the first basic thing that the government can do, and I understand the government is considering that path carefully. The second, and to answer your question, Dr. Shweri, and most important, is that all of these countries have adopted a mean of financing through which is called the non-recourse or limited recourse project financing, which substantively enables the government to invest and develop big and mega assets, in industry assets, with the fraction of the capital that the government otherwise had to have available if the government is going and using their own resources. And that's a long topic of discussion. We can elaborate.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to, we're going to come back to these policy issues and how to structure things between the private sector and the public sector. But talking about alternative energy and the balance and developing policy for that, anything to specifically add to that from your experience?
And just going back to everybody, and especially George's point in the panel about renewable energies and the fact that in every single government where these renewable energy projects started, including the United States, the government has provided the right incentives for the private sector to get into the renewable energies. For example, in the States, I've represented many sponsors and banks in financing wind farms. And the most important package given by the government was tax incentives.
Yes.
Now, of course, you need to have a modern tax code and tax incentives, but as early as in the late 2000s, the Obama administration has provided even cash grants, meaning that they paid a couple of $100 million to private investors just to cover part of their investment cost and turn what would otherwise be an unprofitable business into a profitable one. So the government's incentives are important.
Thanks, Dr. Azar. These are specific recommendations. Again, they're very useful. We have an investor here who does that for a living. So perhaps he can tell us, following what Dr. Azar said, what do you expect when the government, the Lebanese government already targeted 12% renewable energy fraction by 2020. I'm not sure if we're anywhere close to that. I think the Lebanese university study that I read yesterday from 2013 had it at 0.4%. The data is probably from 2012 or 2011. So I don't think it has budged very much. As an investor, what would you like to see being done at the government level that would encourage you to specifically invest in Lebanon in the alternative sector to reach this 12% goal without taking huge risk?
Well, I'll be happy to give a specific recommendation, but before I do that, I think we should understand that although I'm a big believer in technology and what it has done to mankind and what technology progress in energy has done in many countries, but let's face the truth. All of these technologies are expensive, they're not cheap. That's why they need government support. Many of these technologies like solar and wind, they're intermittent, meaning they cannot be supplying electricity 24 hours a day. So you have base load of energy requirement. So the answer, there's no silver bullet. It should be all of the above. You can add wind, you can add solar, but let's face it, a substantial part of the energy supply will have to come from fossil fuels. And natural gas is the solution. Now, if we want to start building a mix of renewable, absolutely. It's clean, but it's not cheap. Now, so how do you fund it? It's capital intensive. I mean, every kilowatt of capacity in solar is probably $4,000, $5,000, $6,000. I mean, it is 4, 5, 6 times the cost of installing a power plant. Of course, sun is free. You have to pay for natural gas, but still, on a lifetime equivalent price per kilowatt hour, it's still much more expensive than
Allow me
fossil
to
fuel.
just focus to policy
Specifically
recommendation.
on the policy,
Yes.
if we decide we want a mix of renewable,
Yes.
I think the private sector has to come in, like Ziad is saying, with the public sector. And the scheme or the tool that has been used successfully is where the government gives a feed-in tariff, meaning anybody in the private sector can invest and build a power plant. You decide to do 10, 15, 20 megawatt plant, solar plant in the Bekaa Valley. Every electron you produce from that power plant, Electricité du Liban is obliged to buy it at so much cents per kilowatt hour for the period, for a long period. Otherwise, you cannot finance it. So there has to be a feed-in tariff. There has to be an obligation by the government to buy your power that you produce over time so you can finance it. So feed-in tariff is the solution.
Great, thank you. We have about 25 minutes left. I want to include, that includes the question period from the audience. Before we go to the audience, I want to follow up on, you mentioned that even in the best case, still the major source will be fossil fuel, even if we reach the 12%. So let me then go back and touch a little bit on ODL and on power production in Lebanon, since even in the best case, they're still going to be our major source. Fossil fuel power production will be the main source. According to the Lebanese University study, ODL is a disaster right now. It's I'm quoting. I'm not passing a value judgment. It's stuck in 1960s type transmission technologies and practices, and has a lot of endemic problems both on the managerial level and technical level. The question that's being discussed right now, whether to centralize or decentralize power in Lebanon. And I'm wondering if Mr. Sassine can tell us some thoughts that his organization have developed and that he can frame into recommendations before we, in about a minute or so, before we open the discussion to include the audience. Please go ahead.
Thank you. If you want electricity in Lebanon 24/7, the solution is very simple. You can build 2 or 3 power plants the size of the Zouk power plant in Lebanon, and you're good. Okay? It's not a technical problem. We know how to generate electricity. The problem is political, and the problem is in our governance system. So if you turn on your TV today in Lebanon, or you talk to any Lebanese citizen, and you ask them, what is the solution to the electricity crisis in Lebanon? A lot of people would come and tell you, look at EDZ, Électricité de Zahle. And they basically decentralized, right, the generation of electricity, and they provide it for their area, right? Instead of having a centralized power plant that feeds all of Lebanon, or all of Beirut. And they've privatized it, right? So what does that say? These are the 2 questions we need to ask ourselves. The first one is, what is the government involvement in the sector? Do you privatize it, or do you keep it public? And what is the level of this involvement?
So you have centralized, decentralized, privatized, or not privatized.
Exactly.
So
the second one is centralized versus decentralized. The answer is you need a hybrid system across the board. You need a public-private partnership, like Ziad said. You need a centralized and decentralized system, and it is centralized and decentralized today. The reality is that the government, EDL, provides 75% of your electricity today. 20% is provided by the private sector and illegal private generators, right? So one way to think about it, this is a proposal, it might be a little bit crazy, but I want to throw it out there for us to think about it together. How about, as the government thinks how to privatize the sector, and thinks about how to design the market and how to design your competition laws to incentivize and develop, you know, this private sector and this private involvement, right? As you transition, and as you think about what is the best mix of centralized versus decentralized, renewables versus fossil fuels, as you think about these mixes, you have all these private generators already in Lebanon. You don't need to invest to get them. They're right there. They're producing, they're not efficient, but they're there.
So you're advising that will be absorbed, regulated by the government?
So my recommendation is, let's take advantage of these private generators, let's regulate them, and involve them in a transition plan, right? Where you would phase them out over the next 5, 10 years, but they are part of the solution. Right? Nobody has ever talked about this. So let's regulate these private generators, let's set the prices, let them deal with the government directly, sell electricity to the government instead of selling electricity to private citizens. So that's
Thank you,
just an idea to throw out there.
Appreciate it. Great. So I would like to ask the audience to, while asking questions or formulating questions, to keep in mind that we have a charter, we have an assignment to come up with recommendations. You can definitely ask questions on the topics we brought up to clarify them. And also, please feel free to make comments, to criticize. Some of the recommendations are up to be considered before we include them in the final recommendation list. If you have light to either support them or shoot them down, please go ahead and enlighten us. So we'll take questions. Yes, please go ahead. A microphone to the gentleman here, please. Yes. Microphone to the gentleman. Can we pass a microphone to the gentleman here? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Charles Bustani from Montreal, Canada. I've been listening to what these gentlemen were talking about the potential of the oil. Can anyone tell me what is the forecast of the oil market value from over $120 a barrel to below 30? Will the return on investment is still valid as far as Lebanon is concerned? Thank you.
George, you want to pick it up, please?
Can I answer that? Yeah. There are two schools of thought here. Now that oil prices are low, the question is, would oil and gas companies be interested in investing in Lebanon, at least offshore? There's a yes and there's a no, right? The people that say yes tell you that given that oil prices are low, they have driven down the cost of the equipment that you would use to drill offshore, which changes the economics of you drilling offshore and makes it, attractive for you as an investor and as an oil company. That's one way to think about it. The second school of thought is what you're insinuating, which is oil prices are so low that it does not make economic sense for oil companies to invest. And one initiative that I'm trying to launch is invite the oil companies that are interested in investing in Lebanon, make them meet with the government, meet with civil society, and ask them one question. What would you want to see that would incentivize you to come and invest in Lebanon in its oil and gas sector? And I'm going to be perfectly honest, it might be a mistake for me to share this, but over the past 6 months, we've been trying to approach oil companies. We haven't been very successful convincing them that it is worth their time sitting with us to advise us on what they would want to see to incentivize them to go to do business there. That's the reality of it.
Sad but true. But President Jabra had a question there. Could you please pass him the microphone? Or a comment?
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Chairman, and members of the panel for your contributions to this important topic. I have a very, very simple question. In this particular endeavor, what should be the role of universities in Lebanon and how that role should be played? Thank you.
Thank you. As an academic myself, and with an academic sitting next to me, I was hoping someone will ask this question. So thank you, Joe. So actually, Professor Dagher has been instrumental in making University of Maine a leader in the field of offshore wind energy. And he grew a center for composite material research into probably the most important in the world. So I would like to ask him to answer that question and to tell us about the role academic institutions like yours have played and how we can extrapolate to Lebanon.
Thank you for asking that question. One thing that academic institutions have that others don't have is the credibility with the public. So recommendations typically coming out of academic institutions can be trusted as being, in general, unbiased and for the good of the public, of the sector. So engaging universities in looking, for example, at the energy situation in Lebanon and doing some research in that area could lead to some recommendations that are unbiased and tilted towards one industry or the other. I think that's one major opportunity. The other thing is universities will also are able to carry technology forward. We have an opportunity here to develop technologies that are good for Lebanon. For example, in Maine, Maine's governor asked me to lead efforts for the state of Maine to develop offshore wind. And he went to a university to do that. And there's similar models can be used in Lebanon as well. So that's it. The last thing is over the long run, the universities can educate students to go into these new sectors. So for example, if we look at renewable energy, and there is a very strong renewable energy curriculum within universities, then it can help grow the economy in the long run. these are typically three opportunities, if you wish, that universities can participate. But we are thought leaders. We are unbiased, and we can help provide unbiased information. That's very important. We talked about renewables versus the cost of renewables versus the cost of fossil fuels. Of course, if you're in the fossil fuel industry, you're going to say fossil fuels are cheap, let's go use fossil fuels. If you're in the renewable energy industry, you're going to say, well, it's clean, we should go use renewable energies. You can go to the university, we can tell you what makes the most sense. One thing is, we have a moral responsibility in Lebanon to clean up the air. In the US only, there's about 40,000 people who die due to pollution resulting from fossil fuels being burnt. That's respiratory pollution and others. If you go to Lebanon, I don't even know what the numbers are. What is the cost of someone's life at the end of the day? What is the cost of a Lebanese person's life driving in Beirut and so forth? So it's really important. It's really important for all of us to think about the cost of human life as we look at the energy strategy and universities can help in that as well in developing those kinds of unbiased strategies.
Yes, since I'm also an academic, I would like to add one. This is the only topic I can really contribute on with some level of authority. It's hard for university students, while they're being educated, to be involved in changing policy, of course. It's hard for them to be involved in, let's say, ODL and its restructuring, but they can do something that happens in many third world countries, where students get involved at the senior level in engineering, in applied physics, in chemistry, in science, in applied science. They can be involved in local projects. Imagine, and there was a recommendation from a study done by the Lebanese Academy of Science, which was finished recently and about to be released. The study recommends that universities like LAU, AUB, and LU to have programs where senior students, for example, adopt solar energy in their villages and homes and form a network, and that will be part of their thesis or their final projects, to spend a year convincing their families, in their home villages and hometowns, to participate in a network of solar energy that will turn all of Lebanon into a laboratory managed by students at universities. So there's a specific idea. It's been done in Africa very successfully. It's been done also outside Africa in the US. And that's something that could be an answer to your question. Yes, please. The gentleman right there. Oh, somebody has stolen the microphone, so we'll start with you.
Okay, hi. My name is Marwan Azi. I'm a partner at Chadbourne & Park, a law firm here in New York. Thanks a lot for your valuable ideas. I think the main point that George raised is very important. It goes to corruption. If we want to think about infrastructure project, this is a main issue that we need to address. Ziad and I worked on financing power plants in the Gulf, and we have seen the appetite of investors and developers and banks from all over the world, from Japan, to finance those projects. We know the technology work in renewable. We know that conventional power, the PPP model works, and it's cheap to the government to implement it. The issue, I guess, and we know that we have so many Lebanese developers building wind farms in Africa, for instance, pitching for solar projects in Egypt. It's there. The main issue, and I want to stress, and thank you, George, for raising it, is we need to show transparency. We need, as Lebanese, to think about the bigger corruption problem we have in Lebanon. I know that Minister Basile and other policymakers are working on this, are trying, but unless we resolve this issue and we tell investors that your money is safe in our country, I don't think any creative or good idea will work, but we need to think again about how to fight corruption. Thank you.
Great, thanks. I'll keep that comment in mind and come back to it at the end of our discussion in 5 minutes.
Dr. Shreddy, if you don't mind, I'm here next to you, on your left, right here.
Oh, sorry. I was wondering where that voice is coming
from. Would you mind, I just want to make a comment on transparency.
Go ahead, please, quickly. Yes, please.
This is really important, and all of you should be aware of this. This is not theory, this is what's happening right now, and what we can do together as Lebanese citizens to make a difference. I'm going to give you a few examples. We don't know, we haven't kickstarted the oil and gas industry yet in Lebanon, so there's not real corruption yet, correct? But there are a few things going on right now that raise eyebrows and makes me very scared. And I'm going to give you a few examples. One of the decrees that needs to be passed by the Council of Ministers to kickstart the industry hasn't been passed yet, but there's one article in that decree that says that if you are an oil company and want to come and invest in Lebanon, you have to partner and subcontract with a local company. So there's a risk here. Okay. Yes, sir, there is. Okay. It hasn't been passed yet.
But I will, please finish the question, and we'll let the government a chance to address
so
it.
It has not been passed yet, but this article is on the table. And what it scares me, right, is that this would legalize corruption. So imagine this. You're an oil company. You're not going to give a bag of cash to politicians. You would have to partner with a local company, and then the question is, who owns this company? And so what we are asking for is to be transparent, very simple, disclose the ownership of who owns these companies that are going to be involved in the oil sector. That's number one. The second thing is, in order for us to have transparency in the sector, we need to make sure that we can influence these laws before they're passed. So right now, let's say a decree or a law is passed. What happens? You find out about it in the newspaper. If you're not happy with it, you criticize it a little bit, and then nothing happens. It is very hard for us as citizens, as civil society, to influence these laws. So
can you just summarize?
So my recommendation is we need to be able to see these draft laws before they're passed and be able to have a seat on the table to influence them.
Great. Actually, this is a unique opportunity because usually the panels I sit on come up with great recommendations to put them in the pipeline. Sometimes they go nowhere, even in the US. In Lebanon, they're probably also guaranteed to go nowhere. However, today is a very unique opportunity. We have the government a few feet from us, right here in front of us, a very active member of government, or leading a member of the government. So we'd like to ask him to respond. I want to put him on the spot and get him a microphone so Mr. Basil can respond some of the issues to some of the issues raised. And
this is the end?
This is the end, yes. I think we only have 7 minutes. I intend to finish on time. So please go ahead.
Thank you again for giving me the chance to meet with people like you and to learn some more things today. First, I want to say that I heard so many things with whom I agree or I approve or I disapprove. It's not important. What we all agree on is that what is lacking in Lebanon is not to have the resources. We have them. We have the wind, the sun, the water, the oil resources. We have the human resources, people like you. We have the plans for everything. It's not true that we have a mapping for the wind. Onshore Lebanon, not offshore, because offshore is something roughly recent. We have very advanced 3D seismic surveys that would put us in a position, I agree with all what you said, but you are a little bit conservative. We are in a position where we can say, yes, we have our resources, our prospects are well promising. So we don't need 7 years, but all this is that Lebanon did in a small period of time a lot of progress. But this is not the problem. What is lacking? We have everything. What is lacking? What is lacking is the political decision. And here where we need foot soldiers to make the real change in Lebanon. I'm not putting the blame on any one of you, and this is a point of division in Lebanon. But this is the truth. We need to make the real change of a political class that is corrupt and that is not allowing things to happen. We have the last power plant was not built in 1996. It's in 2016. We have 2 power plants that are ready to operate now. but they are on hold for a political decision. We have an FSRU, a regasification plant, that can be operational in 12 months. Again, it's a political decision. We have 2 wind farms, 150 megawatts in the north of Lebanon, on hold for political decision. We have the licensing round. No, it's not true. 46 major oil companies came to Lebanon, they subscribed, they were qualified, and the process was on hold. So what we need is trust in the process. And I believe that this is where is our responsibility to make that change. Everything is there is in place. The problem is that we have electricity in Lebanon, but at a high cost. We always have electricity. The cost is high. We have water, but again, the cost is high. So imagine that, for example, we were checking. The Hoover Dam was built in 1936. The dam height is 220 meters. The volume is 35 billion cubic meters. 80 years after in Lebanon, we are not able to build a dam that already started with a capacity of only 30 million. 30 million compared to 35 billion cubic meters. Why? Because of a political decision. So,
well, speaking of political decisions, Mr. Sassine mentioned, and I mentioned earlier, that you recently made a step to unlock the deadlock on the oil and gas exploration. Can you tell us specifically what...
I was going to say it. I have one comment because, again, I am honored to meet people like you. I was very happy to listen to you because all what you said was true except the end. It is not true at all that there is an article that obliges the consortium to have a Lebanese company. Not true. There is an obligation to have a percentage of people working, a small percentage of Lebanese working in the oil companies, which is very normal. But again, there is a fear of the grand corruption in a sector where companies would not participate if there is any fear of corruption. This is not a road that you are building, constructing. It is we are talking of a multi-billion project where companies cannot afford to be part of it. And yes, again, this is the same political class that is causing this fear. Now, for example, what did we agree lately on the licensing round? Nothing. It is the simple truth that nobody wants to believe, that there was no deal. There was nothing. There was a process that should start again with the same conditions for which it stopped 3 years ago. It is the conditions of transparency and professionalism to have the companies participating. Because nobody would participate when you open all your blocks and you want to tender for all your blocks and you want to license all your blocks. This is not serious. So we only agreed that we will have a transparent process. And yes, I can say that we are the guarantors that the oil and gas offshore Lebanon will not be until we are present, but under the conditions of transparency. There will be no corruption, or else let the resources stay where they are without any exploration. So answering your question, there was no deal.
Great. We have one recommendation that we would love to hear your opinion on since we have you with us. And we came up here, recommendations that was first came from Mr. Sassine, but then both the financial expert on the panel and the legal expert thinks is feasible and has been done before, which is for these companies to their prepayment, their sign-up fees, whatever, instead of going into the treasury directly, go to specific projects managed by these companies in Lebanon. Is that something you can see you personally accepting and promoting, or is it illegal as far as Lebanese law, what do you think of a specific recommendation?
Can you repeat it?
Okay, the recommendation is that let's say Total comes to Lebanon and wants to have a contract. It commits, instead of paying $100 million to the Lebanese government, it commits to pay $90 million of that $100 million to build roads or fix something in Lebanon, public works. And they become a contractor, and they will lead that project. Is that something that you would?
This is very conceptual. Talking of CSR aspect, we have no problem with it. Again, I don't want to go into details. We can spend the whole day talking of how much we are ready, and surprisingly, why nothing is happening. Again, this is an issue where we would, put people away from Lebanon. We are here to attract you, not to raise problems that would let people say, let us stay here in North America facing this kind of problems. We bear the responsibility to make the change happen. And we will do the change. I deeply believe that we will succeed. Now we are in a situation in the country and in the region where we are facing so many other threats. Like I said in the morning, terrorism and migration. But again, if we were in a sound system, nothing can justify why Lebanon does not have electricity now. It's shame on all of us, عيب. On people like us, successful people like us, not to have electricity in Lebanon, not to have dams in Lebanon, not to have the offshore gas projects running on in Lebanon. It is a shame on us. And the Lebanese people are silent about it. So please, let us all be foot soldiers and make that change happen.
Thank you, Minister. Well, thank you for being with us. And on that note, I'm very sorry, but I really have to end exactly on time and ask everybody to keep the conversation going. So there will be opportunity to continue this. I want to end on the note. First, the shame note that the minister himself brought up, which is a way to remind us that we are in a situation we should not be in, and all of us are responsible and should help. On that note, I would like to thank the panel members, the panelists. Encourage you, please, to continue the discussion in the next day and a half over the gala dinner and the discussions that's happening in the lobby right here. Thank you very much, everybody. And
allow me, please, 30 seconds, Mr. Shuairi.
Okay, 30 seconds, please.
30 seconds. Mr. Your Excellency. Your Excellency. Mr. Basil. Please, I want to make one plea. Make a commitment to make Lebanon 100% renewable energy. Please.
Impossible.
Please.
We should renew our political class to have renewable energy in Lebanon.
We will leapfrog over the political problem, over the economical problem, and it isn't something that we cannot afford to do. We simply can't. We afford it. We cannot afford not to do it. And
Ladies and gentlemen,
to provide solutions.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, please join us for lunch downstairs. It's downstairs where we had the breakfast in the morning. Downstairs, please.